Chapter 15. The Best of the Islands. This is the best place we've been in yet. It was Stormalong speaking. He was dressed in a pair of khaki shorts and a brown sun helmet, and the whole of the rest of him was as brown as his clothes. The ship lay at anchor in an almost land-locked bay in a pretty island, with behind her the Pacific breaking quietly on the long line of the reef through a break in which she had passed, and ahead and on all the other sides, the tree-lined shores of the Golden Beach. The breeze was very quiet, barely enough to be pleasantly cooling, and the boys could see several canoes being launched to come out to them. It was the Bay of Port Mary, in the island of Oahu, off the eastern end of the Solomons. Oahu was low and tree-covered, and even more pleasing in all its aspects than Kiriwina had been. There was general agreement with Stormalong for once, though Twitter chose the occasion to refer to the great advantages of a place called Yorkshire, somewhere in England, but he was howled down. Several canoes full of natives came out, grinning and offering great strings of freshly caught fish and crayfish and fruit. The fish looked exceptionally good, and it was not long before the steward had bought about a barrel full for a few sticks of coarse tobacco, the general medium of exchange in the Melanesian Islands. Some of the islanders asked also for old felt hats, which they seemed to like, and leather belts, or pieces of calico which they used for laps to tie around their middles. A man with a gay lap, a brass-buckled leather belt, an old pipe, and a battered felt hat was set up for life. By and by a white trader came on board, bringing with him his native wife, the queen of the island, and a strong, big son about 15 years of age, and his youngest daughter. She was a very pretty little girl, aged about 6. As soon as she came on board, she began to dance a dance of welcome by the main skylight, and all hands stopped work to watch her. How beautifully she danced! She was dressed in a little skirt of calico that reached almost to her knees, and her small copper chest was almost covered with pearls of strange beads. She had earrings of some handsome shell in her small ears. Her hair was black and anointed with a sweet oil. Her mother stood by proudly watching the little girl, and beating time to her dance with her hands. In this the boys soon joined, for the rhythm was catching. The trader himself also joined, and he sang. He sang a native song with wonderful words, and then he began to dance too. More canoes of the natives came out, and they sat grinning up on the hammock netting, enjoying the sight. They were pleasant-looking fellows, brawny, deep-chested, and clean. None of them had elephantiasis or any of the loathsome skin diseases too common in the other islands. When they had all danced for some time, the Queen Mother also joining in, the trader gave 3 cheers and stopped. The boys gave 3 cheers too, and the trader cheered again. The captain, the mates, and everybody else had formed a wide circle, and when he perceived that he had so excellent an audience, the trader shouted, "Yip-o-ee," cheered again, and at once began to yarn. And such yarns! He went on all day, stopping only to eat salt horse and stock fish and deep-sea pea soup, which nobody else in the ship would eat, when there was fresh food about. He had been a sailor in Cape Horn sailing ships, and he was delighted to see the Joseph Conrad come to his island. The trader stopped from his yarning only long enough to invite all hands ashore to his home. His plantation, he said, was on another island. He did not try to make a living out of this one. He fished bêche de mer and trocus and grew copra on his big plantation. His chief mate, as he called him, was a huge Negro with gray hair, whose name was Mr. Richardson, he said, and who came from Philadelphia. He was so old he could not remember when he was born, and he had only one arm. The other had been bitten off by a shark when he was captain of a pearling lugger in Torres Straits. Mr. Richardson could tell pretty good yarns himself, but he was nothing to the trader. I say, one of the first white men in these 'ere islands, Mr. Richardson boasted proudly. I's been 'ere so long I's sunburned all over. Yes, sir, sunburned all over. Cripes, said Mocker, I hope I don't get sunburned like that. It takes 50 years, said Mr. Richardson. Sides, you gotta be big and have plenty of skin, so the sun can get it at it. Oh, said Mocker, greatly relieved. Mocker was about 4 feet 8, and showed small sign of ever growing any larger. Mr. Richardson stood well over 6 feet. Ashore, the boys found the island even lovelier than it had looked from the anchorage. The villages of grass huts were the cleanest they had seen. They were all laid out in a most orderly fashion, the houses fronting on open squares of coral sand bordered with pieces of coral rock, and all of them were clean and neat and well constructed. The orderliness of an old sea dog could be seen on all sides, and the boys suspected that the old trader, through the Queen, his wife, had a lot to do with running the island. He's the chief, hey now, Mr. Richardson explained. His wife is the last of the chief's line, and when he done married her, he get the chief's job too, only he ain't always the chief over her. No, sir, that he ain't. The trader looked mightily happy for all that, and the Queen, his wife, seemed a docile and amiable person. She was smallish, about 35 years of age, and very attractive. She was bedecked in many strings of beautifully carved shells, which piled so high about her rather short neck that she had to keep her chin in the air, and she was always smiling. She looked a very nice kind of a woman indeed, thought Stormalong, and he made up his mind, too, that he would come back to Awaraha some day when the little daughter was grown up, maybe. In a canoe shed by the beach, Mr. Richardson, who approached this part of the beach with great respect, pointed out to the boys a big wooden model of a fish in which he said the skull of the Queen's father was kept and worshipped. The model was of a large fish, life-size, a fast, strong fish, of a kind which the natives had formerly been accustomed to worship. No women's allowed to come near these houses, Mr. Richardson explained. It's the big taboo. Taboo? Asked Mocker. What's that mean? That's a very important thing round here. It means you can't do something. The things that's wrong the chief man round here makes taboo. For instance, the natives reckons it's bad luck for women to see 'em making a canoe. It's bad luck even for those women shadow to come on the new canoe. So the canoe house is taboo to all the women's. Even the Queen. Yo, sir, even the Queen. She don't dare come near here. They have strict rules, then, for the natives. You said it, sonny. They don't do what they all likes, same as white folks think they do. They have very strict control all the time. Ain't means plenty. Maybe it wouldn't be so nice to be a native after all, sighed Hardcase, who previously had seen much to envy in this form of life. It seemed a pretty good life, one way and another, what with the ease with which fruit grew and coconuts provided drink, and the wonderful climate, and the plentiful supply of hogs and fish. Mr. Richardson took the boys to the canoe house by the side of the model house, where the skulls of the big chiefs were kept, and there they saw a group of the natives at work making a big canoe. "Every feller round here have his own canoe," said Mr. Richardson, taking a delight in his guide's job, and sounding more and more like a man from the American press. "They don't consider a feller done grown up, for he have his canoe. Then he have to hunt, too, and be good for to fight." "Do they fight, too? I mean hunt heads and all that?" "They used to do that plenty, but now this too small an island, too much government control. They don't hunt heads no more. The kids have to go to school now, same's you. Do they eat each other sometimes?" "No, son, that's only in the bad islands, where they ain't got much food. This a good island. Hey, plenty of food. Plenty of meat. Always, hey, they don't need eat each other." "Do they have any strange customs and things, and medicine men and all that?" "They have plenty strange customs. They got medicine men too, but they got to keep more quiet now. The government don't like the medicine men, 'cause they makes trouble. When I first come here, they used to throw a baby into the sea from the end of the reef, every season before they go for the pearls. Stormalong shuddered. What did they do that for? He asked. That was a sacrifice for the sharks. There's plenty sharks here. But what could the poor baby do to the sharks? That was sacrifice, don't you understand? The medicine men figured if the sharks ate the baby, they go way satisfied. No shark ever ate anybody then. Do they eat people now? Yeah, you see those fellers out in the lagoon now with them big canoes. Stormalong and the other fellows looked out to where a group of 3 canoes were going along slowly, with natives in them queerly decorated with clay and feathers and tufts of palm. The natives were chanting in a strange monotone, and several of them were striking the water with scooped-out coconut shells, making a curious rhythmic beat that was fascinating. "What are they doing?" the boys asked. "That's the big medicine man from Sakina," said Mr. Richardson. "They's looking for the man-eating shark." "What? Can they catch a man-eating shark?" "They certainly can. The other day a big shark done catch a Sikiana feller here and ate him up. Now the boys won't dive no more for that shark is caught. They sent for this medicine man. Now he's looking for the shark. He look all over. No more diving before he take that shark. How will he know what shark he catches? He know. They's native fellers know plenty. They know more'n us white fellers sometimes." Stormalong and the gang were greatly impressed, and turned to watch the queer procession of the rhythmic shark catchers on the lagoon. Slowly they paddled along, while the words of their incantation now surged, now fell almost to nothing, and the strange beating of the coconuts on the water went on. "This," said Mr. Richardson, "brought the sharks to the surface, and then the medicine man could pick out the man-eater." It sounded almost unbelievable to the boys, but they already knew enough not to scoff lightly at native beliefs. It was quite possible that the medicine man could catch the man-eating shark in this way, and it was certain that he knew what he was doing. Stormalong asked if he could go out with the party, but Mr. Richardson was afraid that would be impossible. The shark catchers went on far into the night. The boys could see their flares moving slowly over the lagoon, and hear their chanting. The trader staged a big dance round his fire in the evening, and all hands were invited. The native dancing was very good, very strenuous too, Stormalong thought, for that climate. The natives were dressed mostly in smears of clay and palm branches, and they hopped and danced around hour after hour, as if the sand was very hot on their feet. They had no musical instruments, not even a totem drum. A group of old men stood up and sang, hour after hour, and the dancing went on all night. It seemed mostly to consist of an arrangement of a hop, skip, and a jump, all performed with agility and in perfect timing. Hardcase and Twitter joined in for a while, but they soon gave up. Afterwards there was the dance of the shark and the frigate birds, in which the natives merrily represented a flock of frigate birds. At first they hopped about quietly, probably to show the birds feeding. Then a disturbance arose in the shape of a shark, which was another native in a mask, hopping about grotesquely with his elbows crooked to represent a shark's fins. The other natives, who were the birds, flocked around this one and began to attack him, running in on him and shearing off again. Then they began to kick him slightly as they ran in, and in the end, in a great burst of merriment, they got hold of the shark and threw him into the air. Then they did the dance again, and two great stalwart chaps seized Stormalong for the shark. Storm was scared at first, but it was good fun. He got to like it very much, and danced with the village braves far into the night. The light of the fire flickered, and the incantations of the shark searchers fell weirdly on the stillness of the night, whenever for a moment the dance music ceased and there was a pause in the thumping of great native feet upon the warm earth. It was a queer, barbaric place, fascinating. Stormalong almost expected to see, before the night was out, the skulls of the old chiefs come out from the taboo house and join grinning in the dance. It was time to go down among civilized people once again. The ship had been a long time in the islands. In the morning she went out, passing close by the Sikiana medicine men, who were still beating the waters and chanting in their hunt for the man-eating shark. Stormalong, aloft, loosing sail, saw the brute lengths of several sharks shimmering far below, and he looked back over the coral land and smelled the good smell of the warm earth and the growing things, and turning his head out to sea, drew a deep breath of the salt air. It was good to be alive. A fresh breeze blew, and the trader followed in his boat, laden to the gunwales with the villagers singing. The air was fresh and sweet and beautiful, and the breeze and the swelling sails blew the little ship on. Chapter 16. Treasure Trove. We're going treasure hunting now. Who told you, Storm? Slobber, I expect. Slobber told me first, Mocker. But then I heard the mate talking to Chips about it, and Chips told me. It's right enough. We're going back to New Guinea. Where? New Guinea. Some place called Bramble Haven or something, with a map and an old deathbed confession and all that stuff. I don't know about that, but we're going after treasure anyway. It will do me, announced Hard Case. I've been around Melbourne long enough. It had been Stormalong who made the announcement to the assembled gang, taking time off for a spell after clearing up the 'tween decks one Saturday morning while the ship lay alongside the Gellibrand Pier in Melbourne. Storm was reclining at full length on a form, stroking a ginger kitten from the Solomon Islands with the one hand, and fondling a grey cat from Ipswich with the other. The little cats were his constant friends. There had been talk of some mysterious enterprise for some time, but nobody knew the details. The boys had read in a newspaper the previous evening that the Joseph Conrad was going off somewhere under sealed orders. Newspapers always knew everything, but it was no pirate's deathbed confession that sent the Joseph Conrad on her quest, and it was gold she sought rather than treasure, real, solid yellow gold, to be dug out of the ground or washed from the clay in New Guinea streams. The ship was over a year out from New York when she finally arrived at Melbourne in Australia, after paying a brief visit to Sydney first. Sydney was a fine place, where the boys went sailing in the local yachts and had a grand time. Melbourne was a good place too, but they had been there already over 3 weeks, and 3 weeks is a long time to spend in any port. There was so much talk, and there were so many rumors about the treasure expedition that at length the boys deputed Stormalong and Twitter as a committee to ask the captain about it, if only in order that they should be able to write home and let their parents have their next address. "Please, sir, we would like to know what our next address will be," asked Stormalong. That seemed as good a way of bringing up the subject as any. The captain stroked his beard a while. "Well, son," he said, "I'll put a notice up in the 'tween-decks when all the plans are ready, but that won't be before we go to sea. I can only tell you now that the next address will be in Auckland, New Zealand, and after that, Samurai, in the territory of Papua." "Samurai, sir, where is that?" Samurai is a small island off the eastern tip of New Guinea. We are to sail there. May we know, please, roughly where the ship is to go after that, so we may tell our folks about it when we come home? Surely we shall look for a certain island near New Guinea. Then we shall cross the Pacific to the Polynesian groups and sail from Tahiti round Cape Horn to New York. Anything else?" The captain smiled. "Thank you, sir. That's all we'd like to know." Within a few days the ship had sailed. She took on board a lot of big cases filled with mysterious stores, and tents and bales of rope, and picks and shovels. With these came 4 big men who had a regular arsenal of guns. They had shotguns, revolvers, rifles, and even a submachine gun. Mocker, who had helped stow the gear in the after 'tween-decks, reported to his curious watchmates that one of the guns must be an elephant killer. The leader of these gold seekers looked pretty tough. The second day out from Melbourne, when the ship was beating through Bass Strait, with the coastline of Tasmania in sight, the following notice was pasted on the 'tween-decks board: "The ship is bound to Samurai in New Guinea, via Auckland in New Zealand. From Samurai she is to proceed towards the island of Tagula in the Louisiades, where gold has been discovered. Here the gold party is to be landed and the ship, after seeing that they are safely and securely established, will sail towards Tahiti and so homewards to the United States and England. Any cadet not wishing to return to New Guinea or to sail with the ship round Cape Horn in midwinter, which this change of plan will necessitate, may go home from New Zealand. That was all. Cripes, said Mocker, I don't see much treasure in that, and Cape Horn in midwinter, it's me for going home. Did Miss Moss forget her cold cream, maybe, scoffed young Twitter, getting cold feet instead, or something. I'll go where you go, yelled Mocker at that. And I'll go where the ship goes, said Twitter quietly. Well said, Twitter. The boy's coming on. Stormalong chipped in. And so say all of us. We go where the ship goes. Miss Moss can go back to girls' school if she likes. Girls' school, my blooming foot. One of these days I'll show somebody here who's a sissy, yelled Mocker. I'll go on with the ship if we go looking for post holes down at the South Pole. I'll stay here if only to see you bunch of saps don't get her into trouble. Yeah, said Andy, good men'll be needed. Mocker wondered whether he meant it. Still, when about 3 weeks later the little ship put in at Auckland, the pretty port of New Zealand's North Island, to ship a sailing cutter, and some more of the gold expedition's gear, 3 or 4 of the older fellows left and went home. Some of them had had malaria fever rather badly, and all of them had been over a year in the ship. The captain took 3 young New Zealanders in their places, 3 likable young chaps named Crawford, Henley, and MacDougall. MacDougall was a good egg, and Crawford was first-rate company. Henley was a brawny chap, a good sailor, and a good shipmate. The 3 of them fitted in well, and even Mocker approved of them after a while. Not that it would have mattered very much if he hadn't. Crawford socked Mocker one of the first night he was on board. Just to keep him in place, Mocker started giving orders. From Auckland the ship sailed up through the Coral Sea, direct to Samurai. It was the cyclone season, and they passed through 2 severe storms, in which the ship suffered no damage worse than a fractured 4 trestle trees. It blew pretty hard, always from the direction in which the ship wanted to go. When they had been a week outside Samurai, getting steadily farther and farther away in spite of all their efforts to get to windward, it began to be a bit depressing. I don't know why they don't have steamers, said Mocker. Stormalong glared at him. Steamers, said he with great scorn. Steamers are for softies. Well, I don't see the sense in going in sailing ships where everything's so hard, when you know darn well you could be in a steamer, and the weather wouldn't matter. At least you'd get where you were going. And don't we? Yes, Mocker had to admit that they did. In time we do. Well, why not come out with it straight and admit you're only moaning about the work? I'm not moaning about the work. If Mocker was moaning, what he had to say was nothing compared with the loud wails of the gold expedition's men back aft. The gold men kept themselves to themselves and moaned every time anybody went down the after 'tween decks. They could be seen sprawled around a table moaning. Some of them were seasick, and the violent motion of the ship upset them greatly. None of them had ever been in a sailing ship before, and it was scarcely likely, from the looks of them, that they would ever go again. The ship beat on and on. It was hard going, but after a week of being blown away, she at last began to make something. She was a good little ship, always anxious to do her best, but the rigging had been strained by that time, and the old sails began to blow away very easily, and the boys had a hard time of it on deck. Several times they had already seen the reefs off the chain of the Louisiade Islands, towards which they were bound, but the ship could not go into Tagula before she had been first to Samurai. They saw Tagula twice. It was a high, mountainous island, looking rather interesting. At length the captain, despairing of ever beating back to windward of Samurai in the open sea, took the ship in among the reefs to go that way. This was perilous, but it was the only chance. She anchored every night in some sheltered spot. The first night among the reefs, the Conrad anchored in a big lagoon, about 10 miles across, called Bramble Haven. The next day it was calm, and she could not go on. Starboard watch ashore and collect firewood on the beach was the order. They swung out the lifeboat and pulled in towards the beach of a low sandy islet, close to the part of the lagoon where the ship was anchored. Here the boat took the ground easily, and they hauled it up on the beach. Stormalong and the others hopped out, and Joseph the ginger cat with them. Pete had charge of the gang, and at once they began merrily to collect wood, with which the beach was covered. They had brought their lunch of ship's bread and bully beef, and lime juice and water. There was no water on the islet, but there were some pigeons, which Hilgard shot, and they roasted them before an open fire. There were shellfish, and they cooked these. They took several boatloads of firewood out to the ship, Joseph the cat going out with each load, just to see everything had gone all right in his absence. When work was over, the boys swam and explored the islet. It was very small, not more than 100 yards long, and nearby were 4 other islands, strung out in a long row around the edge of the lagoon. One seemed to have been planted once. The others were covered with low trees. They looked as if nobody had ever lived on them, and the boys saw no sign of habitation on the islets near the ship. Stormalong, though, made an interesting discovery. in the last of the daylight, he came across a human skull. It was really Joseph the cat who found it. Joseph was rooting about, as was his wont, now running a bit ahead of Stormalong, and now trailing off astern. Joseph was an inquisitive little cat, and he always liked to investigate anything that took his notice. In the course of an average day, quite a lot of things claimed his attention. All of a sudden, Joseph began to meow excitedly and paw about. "What have you got now, Joey?" said Storm. "What have you got there, boy?" "Meow," said Joseph, digging away with his paws. "Gosh," said Storm, "he's found some bones." The boy dropped on his knees beside the trench the cat was making, and pulled out a complete human skull. "Alas, poor Yorick! I knew him well," Storm began, holding the skull in one hand, with sand dripping from what had been its eardrums. Joseph looked on, wondering. Yorick, he'd never heard of him. Storm, on his knees, looked at the skull a long time, and at the quiet water lapping at the sandy beach, and the beauty of the tropic sunset flaming over the broad lagoon. And he sat and thought a long, long time. Joseph came and sat beside him, looking up patiently and wondering now and then if there might still be a chance to catch a bird. Stormalong arose at length, wrapped the skull carefully in his shirt, which had been round his neck as a scarf, and trudged off back to tell the other boys. Mocker suggested it might be a relic from some cannibal feast of the long ago, and this idea found general favor. Hardcase and Twitter and all of them stared reverently at the skull, and thought how it must have felt when its chops were being eaten, or steaks carved from its stout buttocks. "Gee, I'd hate to be ate," said Crawford. "My grandfather used to tell me back home in New Zealand that Maoris didn't eat sailors much. They didn't like their taste. There was too much salt in their bones, and their flesh tasted too much of rum." "Cripes, it's me for rum from now on," yelled Twitter. "Aw, baloney," said Dave. "Nobody eats anybody now." Joseph was away in the bush looking for birds. These boys' arguments always made him tired, but the birds weren't very tired, and he didn't catch any. The boys brought the skull back carefully on board and stowed it away in the 'tween decks. They were afraid some of the older sailors wouldn't want a skull on board because it was bad luck. Only the other day Chips had been saying it was bad luck to have women on board a sailing ship, and parsons and dead bodies and cross-eyed Swedes. Storm supposed the skull might qualify as a dead body. The skull brought no bad luck to the Joseph Conrad, at any rate not then. There was a nice little fair wind through the night, and she sailed on to Samurai. There the gold men took one look at the jetty, and then hopped up on it with all their gear. Nothing would induce them to come back on board the vessel. "Ha!" said Mocker, "so much for our blooming gold. I'm glad I never did believe in it anyway." Chapter 17. On a Reef and Other Adventures. By the mark 4.5 5.5, the monotonous droning of the leadsman in the chains was a familiar sound to the Conraders in coral waters. The ship, outward bound towards Tahiti from Samurai, was slowly sailing out of Wari Lagoon, where she had found overnight anchorage. She was under all sail, but the courses and the morning was fine and quiet, with a gentle land breeze. The reefs looked mighty close. The high bare hills of the island were close on the one hand, and the broad, cruel reef close upon the other. In between, the intervening sheltered water was littered with coral rock and large outcrops of coral formations, which were most beautiful but dangerous too, and the captain was on the fore-topgallant yard, conning the ship. "Starboard a little," he shouted. "Starboard a little," shouted Jim in reply, from the wheel where Pete, the second mate, kept eagle eye. The mate was forward on the forecastle head. "Steady." "Steady, sir. Port a little. Weather crojack braces there." "Port a little, sir," from Jim. "Weather crojack braces," came Pete's answering hail. The little ship slipped quietly along, as she so often had before. It was dangerous kind of sailing, of course. Stormalong, Hardcase, Twitter, Mocker, Andy, Crawford, and the rest of them were kept running about the decks, from brace to brace and line to line. She was almost out now. This was to be the last of the tropic anchorages before Polynesia. From the cross trees, the boys could see the open waters of the Coral Sea. "By the mark 3, chanted the leadsman. "Port a little," from the topgallant yard. "Port a little, sir," came the helmsman's prompt echo. But the ship would not answer the helm. She was almost out of the lagoon now, right in the reef's mouth, where the tides and the currents eddied. "Port, port, hard over, helmsman," shouted the captain. "And a half 3, chanted the leadsman, swinging his hand lead rapidly now. 2 fathoms. The ship drew 11.5 feet. "Square the crojack yards from aloft." "Square up," shouted Pete, blowing 2 whistles for his watch. But while the boys scampered along, they felt the ship just slightly stagger in her stride and stop. "Less than 2 fathoms, sir," shouted the leadsman now. "Lines up and down." Stormalong looked over the side to see the water going past the ship now, instead of the ship going through the water. She was on the reef aground. She was on the reef all right. She had slipped up on it so quietly that it felt as if the reef had stretched a hand out beneath the ship, and then just lightly lifted it as the ship passed over. It didn't really feel as if anything was seriously wrong, but it was bad enough. The boys looked down and saw coral all around them, save ahead, where the open sea beckoned so close. Now the wind, which had been quiet, began at once to freshen, and breakers started to rush in and lift the ship's bows and throw them crunching down on the coral, at the same time trying to wedge the ship farther on the ground. The captain slid down a backstay to the deck, and at once, in a very quiet voice, as if nothing were wrong, began to issue a stream of orders to the mates. "Get the dinghy out, and sound ahead," he began. "Let the sails run down, but don't furl them yet. Get the 2 lifeboats out, and a spare spar. Have the carpenter and his gang free the shackle of the best bower. Get up that 120 coil of new 2-inch wire from the hold. Put the boats alongside, misters. We'll have to carry out an anchor and get out of this by hand." The 2 mates began at once to pass on these orders to their watches, and there was a skelter of organized activity. Stormalong and Hardcase found themselves in the dinghy, sent out to sound ahead. They pulled away from the ship, sounding as they went. They could see her bow wedged almost securely on a coral rock. The tide rushed past. It was that had done it, just where she was aground. The tide coming out of the lagoon met the current rushing across the entrance, and there was a nasty series of eddies in which the dinghy swung helplessly round and round, and any ship under sail would be helpless. "Looks like a mess, Storm," said Hardcase, "but I don't doubt we'll get out of it." Storm looked across at the island. "We've got to get out of it," he said. Joseph, who of course was in the boat with him, looked up encouragingly. "Meow," he said, as if he had no doubt of the outcome whatever. The boys found open water ahead of the ship, and reported this. Then they pulled back aboard as quickly as they could to help with something else. There was plenty to do. The big anchor forward was being cleared. A great coil of wire was being brought up from the hold. The 2 big lifeboats were swung out and lowered, and a spare spar lashed across them. The ship was pounding in the breakers, which swirled past her with a greasy satisfaction. The decks reeled stupidly, and the masts shook with the violent pounding. "She won't stand much of this, mister," Storm heard the captain say to the mate, but he did not seem alarmed. Meanwhile the carpenter and his gang worked to free the anchor. It was aground, as the bows were high on the reef, and since it weighed about a ton and was solid iron, it was a Herculean job to get it free. Chips swore and puffed and toiled at it, with hammers and cold chisels, freeing the shackle first, and then directing his gang with tackles to get the flukes up from the rock afterwards. They brought the 2 lifeboats under the bow, lashed together, and maneuvered them so that the stock and the ringbolt of the anchor was between, where lashings could be passed around the ring and the spar. The idea, Stormalong could see, was to carry the anchor away in the boats, though not actually in them, as it was too heavy for that, but between them in the water, with a stout wire fast to it, and then let it go in the deep, clear water, and haul the ship out to that. If she came then, she would be free of the reef, since the anchor would be outside, but only if she came. There was no time for fear, no time for anything save the urgent job. The anchor was free now, and the boats, jumping violently about, were maneuvered into position. The end of the new wire was made fast to the anchor ring, and about half of the wire coiled across the boats. Then, with all hands pulling at the oars, the boats set out towards the clear place where the boys had sounded. How hard it was to pull those boats! The heat belched down. Sweat poured from them until the seats were slippery, and the oars almost impossible to hold. The boats were so jammed with coils of the big wire that rowing would have been difficult in any circumstances, without trying to haul out a heavy bower anchor. Progress was slow and immensely difficult. At first the breakers broke over the 2 boats, so deep in the water were they with the weight of the anchor and the wire, and they threatened to swamp. Then they were beyond the surf, pulling steadily out, but the wire kept jamming on outcrops of the coral rock. Volunteers wanted to clear the wire, said the mate. The boys could see the grim shapes of sharks flitting in the depths of the lagoon. No matter, the wire must be cleared. Stormalong, Hardcase, MacDougall, Mocker, Hilgard, Andy, and a bunch of them offered at once. MacDougall, the new chap, was a good egg. Stormalong and Hardcase will go, said the mate. They're too small for a feed for a shark. Sharks have some respect for themselves. There was a general laugh, even in that predicament, and Stormalong and Hardcase, dropping their clothes in a second, jumped into the water, where they might well have died. They had knives with them, long sheath knives, but most of all they had courage. They swam about like fish in the depths, and cleared the bights of wire from the impeding rocks. The coral cut their hands and stung furiously, but they kept on. At last they had the wire cleared, and climbed back into the boats, and took up their oars again, panting without even bothering to put on their clothes. "Good work, sons," said the mate. "Now lay back on the oars, handsomely now. Remember that Cape Town race." Little Joey, the ginger cat, pushed an understanding nose against Storm's ribs. It was comforting to see him there. The boys pulled and pulled. It was back-breaking work. At last they had got out as far as they could go. They had pulled out all the wire from the ship, and then paid out what had been coiled in the boat. They could go no farther. Lay on your oars was the order, a hail to the ship, and an answering hail cut the stopper. One blow from the carpenter's axe, and the anchor, freed from the spar, fell into the clear depths. Now the boats hurried back to the ship, and all hands piled on board. The wire had been let out over the quarter for the ship. If she came off at all, would have to come stern first. The bow was on too hard. How she pounded! Man the capstan! All hands ran for the forecastle head, and manned the capstan bars. At first the slack came in easily, then it was hard as the seas lifted the ship, and then let her drop back again. They could get in only a little as she lifted. "Heave, my sons, heave there, boys." The captain himself was lending a hand. Slobber Jollop, the steward, everybody were up there on the forecastle head. Joseph the cat, anxious to help, hopped up on the capstan head and meowed encouragingly. Sweat spilled from the struggling crew and made the decks slippery. Bare-footed boys grunted and heaved. The capstan groaned. The pawls clinked slowly. Now she comes. A big breaker had swept in under the ship, lifting her forward. Now, while she lifts, our only chance, my sons, keep her going. Grunt, heave, pawl, muscles straining to breaking point, capstan protesting, ship pounding. Grunt, heave, pawl. Ho, ho there, keep her going, keep her going. Merciful heavens, she moved, she was moving, she came. Yo ho ho, and a bottle of rum, yelled Stormalong. The little ship was coming all right. They had hove her off, got her off the reef to her own anchor by hand. All hands began to sing, and they sang and sang as they walked the long wire in and warped the ship out to her anchor. Stormalong was the song they sang. Stormy's gone, that poor old man. To me, way hey, Stormalong. Oh, Stormy's gone, that good old man. To me, I, Mr. Stormalong. A good old skipper to his crew. To me, way hey, Stormalong. A good old sailor, brave and true. To me, I, Mr. Stormalong. And we don't mean you, yelled Pete to Stormalong, towards whom the boys all doffed their caps in mock courtesy as they sang. Blood from Storm's torn hands stained the bar he was pushing. He grinned and heaved on. Funny fellers, sailors, thought Joseph the cat, singing 1 minute, and they might have been drowned a few minutes before. Strange birds, indeed. He gave them up. After all, they were pretty good to little cats. Late that night, in the first night watch with the ship, which in spite of her pounding had taken no damage, slipping quietly along before a coral sea breeze, with the reefs out of sight and all the islands dropped below the horizon, Storm and his pal Hardcase were lying on a staysail atop the forward house. "I wonder, Jim," Stormalong was saying, "whether that skull we've got had anything to do with the ship's getting on that reef. How could it, Storm? A piece of dead bone can't do anything. I don't know, but I'm going to throw it back in the sea anyway. Maybe it belongs around these seas, maybe. And it doesn't want to leave. Well, perhaps you're right, Stormy. Natives can do funny things, maybe even when they're dead. So the two boys slipped quietly down into the 'tween decks where Storm had the skull hidden away in the bottom of his sea chest. They brought it up on deck, and lashing it on an old hatch, set it to drift back towards the islands in the sea.